Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story. There are summer nights in Appalachia that people remember for ordinary reasons. The smell of rain on warm pavement, insects singing beyond open windows, and porch lights glowing beneath trees become part of childhood and family memory. But during August of 2018, residents of a small mountain community in eastern Kentucky began remembering their nights for something entirely different. It started with a sound heard far beyond the last occupied houses, somewhere along an old road climbing into the forest. Within 3 weeks, people were sleeping with their windows closed despite the summer heat, dogs were being brought indoors before sunset, and several families had temporarily left the valley. Nothing was ever officially declared dangerous. Nobody disappeared. Yet years later, those who lived there still remember exactly when the strange sound first came down from the mountain. The community stretched along a narrow valley containing fewer than 60 homes, many occupied by families who had lived there for generations. Beyond the northern edge of the settlement, the paved road became gravel before climbing toward abandoned timberland owned by several private companies. Logging operations had ended decades earlier, leaving miles of deteriorating access roads slowly disappearing beneath vegetation. Hunters occasionally traveled into the area during autumn, but August was normally quiet. There were no campgrounds, hiking destinations, or occupied buildings beyond the final house. After sunset, almost no reason existed for anyone to travel farther into the mountains. The first incident occurred shortly after midnight on August 6th. A retired mechanic named Harold Bennett was sitting beside an open bedroom window when he heard what sounded like a vehicle approaching from somewhere above the valley. At first, he assumed a pickup truck was descending the old logging road. The noise resembled an engine operating at low speed, disappearing occasionally behind the ridges before returning several seconds later. Harold waited for headlights to appear through the trees. None did. The sound continued for nearly 10 minutes before stopping somewhere beyond the abandoned timber gate. He thought little about it until his neighbor mentioned hearing exactly the same thing the following morning. 3 nights later, the sound returned. This time, at least 7 households heard it. Residents described a low mechanical rumble moving gradually down the mountain shortly after 1 in the morning. Several people stepped onto their porches expecting to see a truck approaching. Instead, the gravel road remained completely dark. The noise became louder for several minutes before suddenly stopping. No headlights appeared, no vehicle entered the community. One resident drove toward the timber gate after daylight and found it secured with a heavy chain that appeared covered in rust. Vegetation had grown across the road behind it, making recent vehicle traffic seem unlikely. The reports might have remained neighborhood conversation if the sound had not returned on August 12th while a county deputy happened to be nearby. Shortly after 1:20 a.m., dispatch received 3 calls within minutes. The deputy drove toward the northern end of the valley and stopped approximately half a mile from the timber gate. According to his incident report, he could hear something resembling a heavy engine operating beyond the ridge. The sound was distant, but distinct enough that he initially suspected unauthorized logging equipment. He waited beside the road, expecting the vehicle to descend toward him. After approximately 4 minutes, the sound disappeared. The deputy inspected the gate using his flashlight. The chain remained locked, and thick weeds covered both tire paths beyond it. No fresh tracks appeared in the gravel leading toward the mountain. He contacted the timber company the following morning and learned that no employees had entered the property for more than 2 months. The company also confirmed that heavy equipment had been removed years earlier from the section of forest overlooking the valley. A representative inspected the road later that week and found no evidence that any vehicle had recently passed the gate. Then the pattern changed. On August 15th, residents heard the mechanical rumble shortly before midnight, but it no longer seemed confined to the mountain. Several families believed the sound had reached the gravel road below the gate. A woman living near the northern end of the community noticed her dogs becoming restless several minutes before she heard it. Both animals moved away from the front porch and remained near the back door until the noise stopped. Across the road, another resident turned on exterior floodlights, expecting to reveal a vehicle approaching through the darkness. The road remained empty. The sound continued anyway. Over the next several nights, deputies began patrolling the valley more frequently. They considered illegal logging, off-road vehicles, mining equipment, and even machinery operating in another valley whose sound might have traveled unusually through the mountains. Weather records were examined because temperature inversions sometimes carry distant sounds much farther than expected. That possibility seemed promising until investigators contacted businesses and landowners throughout the surrounding area. No heavy machinery had been operating during the reported hours. Even if distant equipment explained the sound itself, it could not easily explain why multiple residents consistently believed it was moving along the same abandoned road. The most disturbing incident occurred during the early morning hours of August 19th. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a family living 3 houses below the timber gate woke when their motion-sensitive driveway light activated. Seconds later, they heard the familiar low rumble outside. Curtains prevented them from seeing the driveway clearly, but the sound seemed close enough that they expected a truck to be parked beside the house. They remained inside and contacted dispatch. While waiting for deputies, another motion light activated farther down the driveway. Then another illuminated near the roadside. The lights appeared to be responding sequentially to something moving away from the house. Deputies arrived less than 8 minutes later. They found no vehicle and no person anywhere along the road. The driveway consisted partly of loose gravel that normally preserved obvious tire impressions, yet investigators discovered no fresh tracks beyond those belonging to the homeowners. The motion sensors were tested repeatedly and worked correctly. Small animals occasionally triggered them, but investigators could not reproduce the exact sequence described by the family without physically walking from the house toward the road. Nothing had been captured because the property had motion lighting, but no security cameras. After that night, several residents installed inexpensive trail cameras facing the road. Others borrowed cameras normally used during hunting season and positioned them near driveways. The community hoped that whatever was traveling through the valley would finally be recorded. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The forest returned to its familiar August rhythm, and some residents began believing the strange sequence had ended. Then, shortly after 1:40 a.m., on August 23rd, the rumble returned, louder than anyone remembered. Multiple cameras activated within a period of roughly 6 minutes. The first belonged to a house nearest the abandoned timber road. Several minutes later, another camera triggered nearly half a mile south. A third activated farther down the valley. By morning, residents expected the recordings to show a truck traveling through the community. Instead, every image showed an empty road. There were no headlights, people, or animals visible in any frame, yet the timestamps created an unmistakable progression moving south through the valley at approximately the speed of a slowly driven vehicle. Investigators collected copies of the photographs and examined the camera settings. The devices were manufactured by different companies and belonged to unrelated households. Each had been positioned independently. Equipment malfunction could explain an isolated activation, but coordinated failures occurring sequentially along several miles of road seemed far less likely. Wildlife remained another possibility, although nothing appeared in the photographs. A small animal moving outside the camera's visible range could theoretically trigger some sensors, but investigators could not explain why the activations followed the road in an orderly sequence. Then, something happened that changed the atmosphere throughout the community. The final camera activated beside an abandoned church near the southern end of the valley. The church had closed more than 15 years earlier, and its gravel parking area was gradually disappearing beneath weeds. The camera captured 3 photographs. The first showed the empty road. The second, taken several seconds later, showed the same scene. The third contained a faint pair of white points near the far edge of the frame. Investigators initially assumed they were reflections from an animal's eyes. When wildlife specialists examined the image, they could not confidently determine what had produced them. The following morning, 2 residents walked behind the abandoned church searching for tracks. They discovered nothing unusual until reaching an old access road almost completely hidden beneath vegetation. Older residents remembered that the road had once connected the church property with a small cemetery farther into the woods. Nobody had maintained it for decades. The men followed it for approximately a quarter mile before finding something neither expected. Fresh parallel impressions crossed a muddy section of the old road. They resembled vehicle tire tracks. Deputies photographed and measured the impressions that afternoon. The tracks continued for less than 60 yards before reaching rocky ground where they disappeared. Investigators followed the abandoned road in both directions but found no vehicle. The northern end eventually connected with another forgotten logging route climbing toward the same timberland where the strange sounds had first been reported. Historical maps confirmed that decades earlier, the 2 roads had formed a continuous route through the mountains. Most of that route was now impassable because of fallen trees, erosion, and vegetation. Investigators walked several sections and concluded that an ordinary vehicle could not have traveled the entire distance without leaving extensive evidence. Local interest increased, but the sheriff's office avoided encouraging rumors. Deputies reminded residents that unexplained sounds in mountainous terrain could have natural causes and that old roads sometimes preserved impressions that appeared more recent than they actually were. No evidence indicated that anyone in the community faced immediate danger. Patrols continued anyway. Residents kept their cameras operating. Families who normally slept with windows open began closing them after dark. Nobody wanted to admit being frightened by something they had never actually seen. On August 26th, the sound returned for the final time. It began shortly after 2:30 in the morning near the northern ridge. Residents woke as it moved gradually toward the valley. Trail cameras activated in nearly the same order as before. This time, several homeowners were already watching from darkened windows. They heard what seemed unmistakably like a vehicle approaching. Some even believed they could distinguish tires moving across loose gravel beneath the deeper mechanical rumble. Yet, the road remained empty. The sound traveled past the abandoned church and continued south toward the highway. A deputy waiting near the intersection heard it approaching from several hundred yards away. His patrol camera recorded him stepping from the vehicle and looking north along the road. For nearly 30 seconds, the mechanical noise became clearly audible on the recording. No headlights appeared. Nothing emerged from the darkness. Then the sound passed through the intersection and gradually faded toward the opposite ridge, even though there was no connecting road continuing in that direction. That recording became the strongest evidence collected during the entire investigation. Audio specialists confirmed that the microphone had captured a low-frequency mechanical sound rather than ordinary wind or insects. They could not identify the exact source. The recording contained characteristics consistent with an engine, but insufficient detail existed to determine what type. Investigators compared it with trucks, tractors, generators, mining machinery, and off-road vehicles. Some produced similar frequencies. None reproduced the complete sound recorded that morning. After August 26th, the valley became quiet again. September arrived without another report. Patrols gradually returned to normal, and residents stopped checking cameras every morning. The investigation was eventually closed without identifying a vehicle, driver, or source for the sound. No property had been damaged, nobody had been threatened, and nothing had been stolen. Officially, there was no crime to investigate. Years later, people who lived in the valley still disagree about what happened. Some believe machinery operating many miles away created an acoustic illusion amplified by the mountains. Others suspect someone had discovered a forgotten route through the timberland and deliberately traveled it after midnight. Neither explanation accounts comfortably for everything investigators documented. The locked gate never appeared disturbed. Cameras activated along an empty road. Tire-like impressions appeared on a route considered impassable. And a deputy's microphone captured something moving toward an intersection without anything visible ever arriving. Older residents remembered one additional detail only after investigators began studying historical maps. Before the logging companies abandoned the mountain, trucks carrying timber had once used the forgotten route behind the church to reach the main highway. The road was closed permanently after a section collapsed during heavy flooding in the late 1970s. Several drivers who worked there were still alive when the investigation occurred, and they confirmed that loaded trucks often descended the mountain after midnight during busy summer seasons. The route described by those retired drivers matched almost exactly the direction followed by the unexplained sound decades later. Nobody suggested that old logging trucks were somehow still traveling through the valley. The historical connection proved nothing. Yet every August, when summer begins fading and the mountains become dark before the evening heat disappears, some longtime residents still remember those nights. They remember standing behind curtains and listening to something coming slowly down a road nobody could drive anymore. They remember motion lights turning on one after another while nothing crossed their yards. Most of all, they remember the final night when the sound reached the highway, passed an officer waiting directly beside it, and continued toward a road that had never existed. Whatever moved through that valley was never identified. Perhaps the mountains distorted an ordinary sound in an extraordinary way. Perhaps an explanation existed somewhere among the forgotten logging roads investigators never fully explored. But for the families who lived there during those quiet August nights, the mystery was never about ghosts or legends. It was about hearing something approach night after night, knowing exactly where it should appear, and watching an empty road when it finally reached them. That was what happened during those August nights, and for the people who were there, it was never forgotten. In this new story, there are certain summer memories that never seem to fade. People remember the sound of cicadas after sunset, screen doors closing behind them, and warm August air drifting through open bedroom windows. In small Appalachian communities, those memories often belong to a quieter America when families spent evenings on porches and children stayed outside until darkness covered the mountains. But for residents of one isolated community in southwestern Virginia, August of 2017 became associated with something entirely different. It began with children noticing someone standing beside an old country road after sunset. Within 2 weeks, adults had seen the same figure. By the end of the month, deputies were patrolling the valley every night. Nobody ever discovered who the stranger was, where he came from, or why he always appeared several miles closer to town each time someone saw him. The first report came from two teenage brothers riding bicycles home shortly before 9 o'clock on August 5th. Their family lived outside a community of fewer than 700 residents, surrounded by forest and abandoned farmland. The boys had spent the afternoon fishing at a creek several miles from home and were returning before complete darkness. About halfway through the journey, they noticed someone standing beside a weathered fence near an abandoned dairy farm. The figure appeared to be an older man wearing dark pants and a pale, long-sleeved shirt. He did not wave or attempt to stop them. He simply stood beside the road, facing the surrounding fields. The brothers continued riding and told their father after reaching home. He assumed they had seen a local farmer or someone checking property boundaries. The abandoned dairy farm still belonged to a family living several counties away, and hunters occasionally crossed the surrounding land. Nothing about the story seemed particularly unusual. 2 evenings later, however, an elderly woman living almost 2 miles south of the farm noticed someone matching the same description standing beside her mailbox shortly after sunset. She watched from her kitchen window, expecting the stranger to approach the house. Instead, he remained beside the road for several minutes before she briefly looked away. When she returned to the window, he was gone. The woman mentioned the incident to a neighbor who contacted the county sheriff because several isolated properties had recently experienced minor thefts. A deputy arrived before midnight and searched the roadside. The ground near the mailbox was dry and offered little opportunity for recovering footprints. Nothing appeared damaged, and the homeowner reported nothing missing. The deputy drove several miles in both directions without finding anyone walking along the road. With no evidence of criminal activity, the incident was recorded as a suspicious person report and quickly forgotten. 4 nights later, another sighting occurred. This time, a delivery driver traveling through the valley after completing a late route noticed a man standing beside a narrow bridge nearly 3 miles south of the original dairy farm. The driver slowed because the road had no pedestrian shoulder and worried the man might step into traffic. According to his later statement, the stranger remained completely motionless as the van approached. His clothing looked unusually formal for someone walking through rural countryside during a humid August night. The driver remembered a pale shirt buttoned to the collar and dark trousers extending almost to worn black shoes. No backpack, flashlight, or vehicle was visible nearby. After passing the bridge, the driver looked in his side mirror. The man remained standing in exactly the same place. Less than 15 minutes later, the driver stopped at a convenience store and mentioned the encounter to an employee. The clerk immediately asked whether the man had been wearing a white shirt. That question changed the situation. The employee had already heard about the previous reports from residents farther north. The driver contacted the sheriff's office before leaving the store, providing the first detailed description collected from someone unfamiliar with the local stories. Deputies began comparing the 3 sightings. None of the witnesses knew one another personally. Their descriptions were remarkably similar, yet one detail attracted more attention than the clothing. Each sighting occurred farther south along the same road. The first location was beside the abandoned dairy farm. The second occurred near the woman's mailbox. The third happened at the narrow bridge. When investigators plotted the locations, the unidentified man appeared to be moving steadily toward the center of the community, despite nobody ever seeing him walking between locations. Patrols increased during the following week. Deputies drove the road after sunset, while residents were encouraged to report anyone walking alone. Officers expected the mystery to end quickly. The stranger was probably a transient traveler, a local resident experiencing confusion, or someone deliberately frightening people. Every explanation required the same thing. Eventually, someone should see him moving from one place to another. Nobody did. On August 14th, a family returning from dinner encountered the figure approximately 1 mile beyond the bridge. Their dashboard camera was operating at the time. The recording later showed the family's vehicle traveling along an empty road before the headlights illuminated something near the right shoulder. For less than 3 seconds, a human-shaped figure appeared beside a utility pole. The image was blurred by motion and darkness, but investigators could distinguish light-colored clothing above darker legs. The driver slowed immediately. By the time the vehicle stopped and reversed approximately 100 feet, the roadside was empty. Deputies arrived 9 minutes later and searched the area using flashlights and a tracking dog. The dog briefly followed a scent from the utility pole toward an overgrown field before stopping near a collapsed stone wall. Beyond the wall stood nearly 40 acres of abandoned farmland surrounded by forest. Officers searched until after midnight without locating anyone. No fresh campsites, discarded food, clothing, or evidence of long-term occupation were discovered. The property owner confirmed nobody had permission to stay there. The dashboard recording was examined by investigators the following morning. It clearly documented something beside the road, but the resolution was too poor to identify a face or determine age. Detectives could not even establish whether the person captured in the video was the same individual described by earlier witnesses. What they could confirm was that someone or something roughly human in size had been present when the vehicle approached. For the first time, the strange reports were no longer based entirely on memory. News of the footage spread quietly through the community. Parents began collecting children before sunset, evening walkers changed routes, several residents installed inexpensive security cameras facing the road. Nothing openly dangerous had occurred, but the pattern itself made people uncomfortable. The stranger never approached anyone. He never asked for assistance. He never entered a yard while being watched. He simply appeared beside the road, remained there long enough to be noticed, and vanished before anyone could determine where he went. The next sighting occurred on August 18th, less than half a mile from the first cluster of occupied houses. A retired coal miner sitting on his porch noticed the stranger beneath a streetlight shortly after 10 o'clock. Unlike previous witnesses, he watched for several minutes without looking away. The man stood with his back partly toward the house, facing south toward town. The homeowner considered calling out, but decided against it. Instead, he went inside and contacted dispatch while continuing to watch through the front window. The dispatcher remained on the line while a patrol unit approached from the south. The homeowner could still see the stranger when the deputy reported being less than 1 minute away. Then a passing pickup briefly blocked the homeowner's view. The interruption lasted only several seconds. When the road became visible again, the man had disappeared. The deputy arrived almost immediately. The pickup driver was stopped several miles away and questioned. He remembered seeing the homeowner on his porch, but had noticed nobody standing beneath the streetlight. Investigators searched the area carefully. Behind the streetlight was an open field extending nearly 200 yards before reaching the forest. Anyone attempting to run from the road should have remained visible beneath the moonlit sky. The homeowner insisted nobody cross the field. Deputies found no person hiding nearby. Security footage from a residence farther south showed the responding patrol vehicle approaching the location, but captured no pedestrian leaving beforehand. By then, investigators had documented 5 sightings across 13 days. When plotted on a map, every location followed the same road south. The distance between sightings was decreasing. More importantly, the final location stood only a little over 1 mile from the center of town. Deputies did not publicly discuss that detail, but additional patrol units began remaining in the community overnight. For 6 nights, nothing happened. The absence of reports gradually reduced anxiety. Some residents believed the stranger had realized police were searching for him and left the area. Others suspected the entire sequence had involved several unrelated people whose appearances had become connected through rumor. Investigators considered that explanation increasingly likely. Similar clothing and poor nighttime visibility could easily cause witnesses to describe different individuals as the same person. Then came August 25th. Shortly before 11:30, the county emergency dispatcher received a call from the caretaker of a small church near the center of town. The caretaker had returned to retrieve paperwork left after an evening meeting. As he pulled into the parking lot, his headlights illuminated a man standing near the church cemetery. The description immediately matched the earlier reports. Pale long-sleeved shirt, dark trousers, no visible vehicle, no flashlight. The caretaker remained inside his locked truck and contacted dispatch. 2 deputies were already nearby and arrived in less than 4 minutes. The stranger remained visible for most of that time. According to the caretaker, he never moved toward the cemetery or the surrounding woods. He simply stood near the entrance facing the road. When the first patrol vehicle appeared around the corner, the caretaker glanced toward its flashing lights. When he looked back, the stranger was gone. Deputies immediately surrounded the cemetery. The property contained open grass bordered by a low stone wall and thick forest along its northern edge. Search dogs examined the entrance and several nearby graves, but failed to establish a usable trail. Officers remained until after 2 in the morning. Nothing suggested another person had recently crossed the cemetery. The caretaker's truck camera had captured part of the encounter, but the stranger stood outside the central field of view. Only a narrow, pale shape could be seen near the edge of several frames before disappearing. Investigators expected another sighting within days. None came. August ended quietly. September passed without another report. Patrols eventually returned to normal, and residents resumed evening routines. The unidentified stranger was never located, and no missing person matching his description was discovered in surrounding counties. No criminal activity could be connected to any of the sightings. With nothing further to investigate, the file was eventually closed. Years later, a local historian reviewing old property records discovered something that brought the story back into conversation. The road followed by the sightings had not always been a continuous highway. Before modern construction, it connected several farms with a railway depot that once stood near the center of town. Workers living in the Northern Valley commonly walked the route when traveling to the station. The depot had been demolished in the 1960s, but its former location could still be identified using historical maps. When the historian plotted the sightings against the old map, the progression ended less than 200 yards from where the railway platform had once stood. That coincidence fascinated residents but proved nothing. Thousands of people had traveled the road during the decades when the station operated, and no record identified anyone matching the stranger. Investigators never treated the historical connection as evidence. Still, those who had seen the man found it difficult to ignore. The teenage brothers who witnessed the first appearance are adults now. The retired miner eventually moved away. The church caretaker stopped working nights years ago. None claims to have encountered a ghost. Most accept that an ordinary man probably walked through the valley that August and somehow avoided every attempt to locate him. But one question continues to follow the story. If the stranger was simply walking toward town, why did nobody ever see him walking? Every sighting placed him farther along the same route. Nobody saw him between those places. Nobody saw him arrive. Nobody saw him leave. He appeared beside the road after darkness, stood silently facing south, and vanished whenever attention shifted for only a few seconds. Then, after reaching the place where travelers once waited to leave the valley by train, he was never reported again. For the people who lived there, that is why those August nights remain difficult to forget. Nothing attacked them. Nothing chased their cars or entered their homes. The fear came from watching a pattern unfold slowly enough that everyone could see where it was heading while nobody could explain what was creating it. And years later, whenever longtime residents remember the warm nights of August 2017, some still remember the pale shirt beside the road and wonder where the stranger was trying to go. In this news story, most ghost stories are impossible to verify because they survive only through rumor, family tradition, or stories repeated over generations. Investigators rarely pay attention to those accounts because they usually contain little evidence beyond personal belief. Every so often, however, an incident emerges that attracts the attention of law enforcement, emergency responders, and independent witnesses at the same time. Those cases are remembered not because anyone proved the existence of ghosts, but because every documented fact resisted ordinary explanation. One of the most discussed incidents of that kind began during the autumn of 2016 inside an abandoned elementary school hidden among the hills of eastern Kentucky. What started as a routine trespassing complaint eventually became a case that local investigators still remember years later. The Red Hollow Elementary School had been closed for nearly 14 years after declining enrollment forced the district to consolidate several rural campuses. Since then, the building had remained empty while ownership slowly transferred between county agencies. Electricity, water, and heating systems had all been disconnected, leaving the school exposed to years of harsh Appalachian winters. Although occasional vandals broke windows or painted graffiti inside the gymnasium, deputies rarely considered the property a significant concern. The building sat nearly 2 miles from the nearest occupied home, hidden behind thick woods that discouraged casual visitors. Most local residents eventually forgot the school still existed until several unrelated reports began arriving within the same month. The first report came from two utility contractors inspecting damaged telephone lines after a powerful windstorm. While driving past the abandoned school shortly after sunrise, both men noticed lights glowing inside what had once been the second-floor library. Assuming renovation crews had entered the building without notifying the utility company, they continued their inspection before mentioning the observation to county dispatch later that afternoon. Records immediately confirmed that no maintenance work had been scheduled anywhere on the property. Deputies briefly inspected the exterior before finding every entrance secured with rusted chains, exactly as documented during the previous county inspection only 3 weeks earlier. Several nights later, the County Volunteer Fire Department received an emergency call reporting possible smoke coming from the school roof. Firefighters arrived expecting an electrical fire despite knowing the building had no active power service. Upon reaching the property, they discovered no flames, no smoke, and no heat anywhere inside the structure. Thermal imaging cameras detected only normal temperature differences caused by cooling, concrete, and broken windows exposed to the night air. Before leaving, however, one firefighter quietly mentioned noticing what appeared to be movement at the far end of an upstairs hallway while searching the building. Other crew members dismissed the observation as shifting flashlight reflections, and the incident received little additional attention. The investigation changed during the second week of October when a deputy sheriff conducting routine patrol noticed something unusual while driving along the county highway below the hillside. Through gaps in the trees, he briefly observed several classroom windows reflecting a warm yellow glow, unlike ordinary sunrise or vehicle headlights. Curious, after hearing earlier reports, he drove directly to the property. By the time he reached the parking lot, less than 4 minutes later, every window had returned to complete darkness. The deputy searched the entire building alone before requesting additional officers. Dust covered every classroom floor, fallen ceiling tiles blocked several hallways, and years of accumulated debris remained completely undisturbed. There was no indication that another person had entered the school. Because multiple independent witnesses had now reported similar observations, detectives requested permission to install surveillance equipment throughout the building. Motion-activated cameras monitored every exterior entrance, while additional units covered the central staircase, library, gymnasium, and second-floor hallway where unusual activity had reportedly been observed. Audio recorders capable of operating continuously for several weeks were also placed inside the building to capture any sounds occurring overnight. Investigators expected the equipment to identify trespassers within days. Instead, nearly a month of recordings produced an entirely different puzzle. No unauthorized person was ever recorded entering or leaving the school. Even so, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports describing lights visible inside upper classroom windows before dawn. When technicians reviewed the surveillance recordings, they found nothing unusual on the video itself. Hallways remained empty, classrooms stayed dark, and exterior cameras showed no activity beyond wildlife crossing the parking lot. The audio recordings, however, attracted immediate attention. On 5 separate nights, microphones placed inside different sections of the school simultaneously captured faint sounds resembling lockers closing somewhere along the second-floor corridor. The sounds lasted only a few seconds before complete silence returned. Structural engineers later analyzed the recordings, suggesting that cooling metal pipes, loose ventilation ducts, or settling roof supports might produce similar noises. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the remarkable consistency in timing and location across every recording. Seeking a practical explanation, investigators invited engineers specializing in abandoned structures to examine the school from foundation to roof. Every electrical conduit, maintenance tunnel, attic space, and basement storage room was carefully inspected. Specialists searched for hidden occupants, illegal electrical connections, battery-powered lighting, or evidence that someone had secretly lived inside the building. They discovered nothing beyond expected storm damage and years of gradual deterioration. Even the upstairs library, where witnesses consistently reported seeing lights, contained only empty shelves, broken furniture, and shattered windows overlooking the surrounding forest. No hidden equipment capable of producing the reported glow was ever found. As detectives expanded their investigation, county archives revealed something unexpected. Maintenance records from the early 1980s documented several complaints filed by evening custodians describing unexplained lights appearing inside empty classrooms after electrical circuits had been switched off during renovation work. At the time, supervisors concluded faulty wiring probably caused the reports, although electricians later found no defects requiring repair. The records contained only brief references and were forgotten for decades until investigators compared them with the current witness statements. Although separated by more than 30 years, both groups consistently identified the same section of the second floor overlooking the eastern hillside. The school remained under periodic observation throughout the winter, but reports gradually became less frequent before stopping altogether after the county approved demolition the following summer. Contractors dismantled the aging structure over several weeks while investigators remained on site, hoping demolition might expose concealed rooms, hidden access points, or forgotten electrical equipment overlooked during previous inspections. None was discovered. Once the final walls disappeared and the property was cleared, every report connected to the abandoned school came to an end. No similar observations have been documented there since. Today, the official investigation remains archived as an unresolved suspicious incident rather than a criminal case. Detectives involved have repeatedly emphasized that nothing uncovered during the inquiry proved the presence of ghosts or any other supernatural cause. Nevertheless, they also acknowledge that several important questions remain unanswered. Independent witnesses reported nearly identical observations without knowing one another. Emergency responders personally experienced unusual events while searching the building. Surveillance equipment failed to identify trespassers despite weeks of monitoring. Engineers eliminated every practical explanation they could reproduce. In the end, the case became memorable not because anyone proved a haunting had occurred, but because every reasonable explanation quietly disappeared long before the questions did. For those who worked the investigation, it remains one of the true ghost encounters that no one involved has ever completely forgotten. In this new story, road trips through Appalachia can change quickly after sunset. A highway that feels ordinary during the afternoon can become almost unrecognizable once darkness settles between the mountains. Gas stations become farther apart, cell service disappears without warning, and a wrong turn can place travelers miles from the nearest town. Most frightening experiences on these roads eventually have ordinary explanations. But during the summer of 2022, two brothers traveling through eastern Tennessee encountered something investigators initially believed was an attempted roadside robbery. Within 48 hours, that explanation had fallen apart. What remained was a sequence of events captured partly on video, supported by physical evidence, and disturbing enough that neither brother has driven that route at night again. 49-year-old Andrew Keller and his younger brother Michael had spent 4 days traveling through Tennessee and western North Carolina, photographing historic railroad bridges and abandoned industrial sites. Both were experienced road travelers who had completed similar trips throughout the Appalachian region for nearly 15 years. On July 23rd, they left Johnson City shortly after 7 in the evening and planned to reach a motel near Knoxville before midnight. Their SUV had recently been serviced, the fuel tank was nearly full, and 2 navigation applications showed the same route. The brothers expected an uneventful drive lasting a little over 3 hours. For nearly half that distance, that was exactly what they got. Shortly after 9:30, construction signs redirected traffic away from their planned highway onto a narrow county road running south through heavily forested hills. The detour appeared legitimate. Reflective signs were positioned at several intersections, and another vehicle entered the same road less than a minute ahead of them. After approximately 12 miles, however, Andrew noticed they had not passed another construction sign. The sedan ahead had disappeared around a bend several minutes earlier, leaving the brothers alone. Their navigation systems continued directing them forward, indicating that the county road would reconnect with the highway in approximately 18 miles. Turning around seemed unnecessary, so they continued. The first unusual event occurred near an old concrete railway underpass. A pickup truck was parked sideways beyond the tunnel, blocking most of the roadway. Its headlights were off, but the driver's door stood open. Andrew slowed the SUV while Michael used his phone to record the scene through the windshield. Neither could see anyone near the truck. There were no hazard lights, emergency triangles, or signs of a collision. Enough space remained along the shoulder for their SUV to pass slowly, and Andrew began maneuvering around the pickup. At that moment, Michael noticed movement among the trees behind them. 3 people emerged separately from the darkness along the roadside. None carried flashlights, and none approached the abandoned pickup. Instead, they moved toward the SUV from behind while remaining several yards apart. Andrew immediately accelerated through the narrow opening beside the truck. The brothers later described the decision as instinctive rather than deliberate. Nothing had happened that clearly proved they were in danger, yet the arrangement felt wrong. Michael continued recording as the SUV cleared the obstruction. The final seconds of the video showed one of the unidentified individuals reaching the center of the roadway, while the other 2 remained near opposite shoulders. Andrew drove several miles before slowing. Neither brother wanted to return toward the underpass, so they continued following the navigation route toward the main highway. Approximately 10 minutes later, they encountered another obstacle. A large tree branch lay across both lanes. Unlike the pickup, the branch was small enough that 2 people could probably have moved it, but dense vegetation prevented driving around it. Michael checked cellular service and discovered both phones had lost connection. Their satellite navigation still showed the highway less than 9 miles ahead. With no safe alternative, the brothers remained inside the locked SUV while deciding whether to move the branch themselves. Before either man opened a door, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Andrew initially felt relieved, assuming another motorist had followed the detour. The approaching vehicle slowed roughly 100 yards behind them and stopped. Its headlights remained pointed directly toward the SUV. Nearly a minute passed without anyone approaching. Then the lights switched off. Michael began recording again. The darkness behind them became complete except for their red taillights reflecting from roadside markers. Neither brother could determine whether the vehicle was still there. They waited another minute before Andrew made a decision that probably prevented the situation from becoming more dangerous. Instead of leaving the SUV, he carefully drove onto the shallow drainage shoulder and pushed through vegetation beside the fallen branch. Tree limbs scraped both sides of the vehicle, damaging paint and breaking the passenger mirror, but the SUV cleared the obstruction. Andrew accelerated immediately. Less than 30 seconds later, headlights reappeared behind them. The unknown vehicle had begun following. Michael's recording captured the lights remaining at a relatively constant distance through several curves. Whenever Andrew increased speed, the vehicle appeared to do the same. Whenever he slowed, approaching sharp turns, the distance between them decreased. For nearly 11 minutes, the brothers believed they were being deliberately followed through an unfamiliar mountain road. Then the headlights disappeared. There was no intersection, driveway, or visible place for another vehicle to turn. Andrew continued driving without stopping until they reached a small 24-hour gas station beside a state highway approximately 15 minutes later. Cell service returned almost immediately. The brothers contacted county dispatch and explained what had happened. A deputy met them at the station, examined the damage to the SUV, reviewed both phone recordings, and requested additional officers search the road. Investigators initially treated the incident as a possible attempted robbery involving a staged vehicle obstruction, a tactic occasionally reported in isolated areas. The physical circumstances appeared to support that possibility. Deputies reached the railway underpass less than 40 minutes later. The pickup truck was gone. Officers found fresh tire impressions on the gravel shoulder, but no abandoned vehicle, personal property, or people nearby. They continued toward the location where the brothers reported encountering the fallen branch. Nothing blocked the roadway. Investigators searched both shoulders, expecting to find broken vegetation where Andrew had driven around the obstruction. Instead, they found no fresh vehicle damage anywhere along that section. When Andrew returned with officers the following morning, he immediately recognized the underpass, but could not identify the location of the fallen branch, despite driving the road twice. The investigation became more confusing when transportation officials reviewed the alleged construction detour. No nighttime roadwork had been scheduled along the brothers' original highway, and the Tennessee Department of Transportation had authorized no detour directing motorists onto the county road. Maintenance crews searched the intersection where Andrew remembered seeing reflective construction signs. None were present. More importantly, fixed traffic cameras recorded the brothers' SUV leaving the highway at 9:37 p.m. Yet footage from the same camera showed no sedan turning onto the county road immediately ahead of them. The vehicle both brothers distinctly remembered following at the beginning of the detour never appeared in the recording. Detectives then examined Michael's phone videos. The first recording clearly showed the sideways pickup beneath the railway underpass. Investigators could also distinguish 3 human figures emerging near the road, although darkness prevented facial identification. The second video confirmed headlights following the SUV several miles later. Nothing in either recording indicated manipulation or editing. That evidence convinced investigators that at least part of the brothers' account had unquestionably occurred, yet attempts to identify the pickup failed. Its rear license plate appeared obscured by darkness, and no vehicle matching its general description was reported stolen or abandoned anywhere nearby. One final detail emerged when investigators compared the SUV's navigation history with the county road network. The GPS data showed the brothers leaving the highway normally and traveling toward the railway underpass. After passing beneath it, however, the recorded route became inconsistent. For approximately 23 minutes, location points placed the SUV intermittently on the county road and several hundred yards inside surrounding forest where no drivable routes existed. Technicians attributed the discrepancy to poor satellite reception beneath heavy tree cover. Even so, the total distance recorded by the vehicle's trip computer exceeded the mapped county road by almost 14 miles before the SUV reached the gas station. Investigators never determined where those additional miles had been driven. The case was eventually closed without arrests because detectives could identify no suspects and establish no specific criminal offense beyond a possible attempt to obstruct traffic. Andrew and Michael never claimed anything supernatural had happened. Both remained convinced that the people near the pickup probably intended to rob travelers, and that inaccurate GPS data made the later events appear stranger than they really were. Investigators considered that explanation reasonable. It accounted for the people, the truck, and possibly even the pursuing vehicle. What it never explained were the unauthorized construction signs, the missing sedan, the vanished road obstruction, or the additional mileage recorded during a journey that should have been considerably shorter. The brothers continued taking road trips together after that summer, but they changed one rule permanently. Whenever darkness approaches in the Appalachian Mountains, they remain on major highways regardless of what temporary signs or navigation applications suggest. Michael still keeps the original recordings stored on 2 separate drives, although he rarely watches them. The most disturbing moment is not the 3 figures emerging from the trees or the headlights following them through the mountains. It is the opening seconds of the first video. Just before Andrew reaches the abandoned pickup, the recording briefly captures the empty road behind them. There is no vehicle visible anywhere in the darkness. Less than 20 minutes later, something was following them from that same direction, and after years of reviewing the journey, neither brother has ever discovered where it came from. In this new story, the Appalachian Mountains stretch for more than 2,000 miles across the eastern United States, passing through 14 states and thousands of small communities. Millions of people hike its trails every year without incident. Families camp beside its rivers, hunters disappear into its forests before sunrise, and retired couples spend quiet weekends driving its scenic roads. Yet, despite its popularity, there are stories that rarely appear in travel brochures or history books. They survive through sheriff reports, ranger journals, local newspapers, and conversations shared on front porches long after the sun goes down. Most of these stories are never presented as proof of anything supernatural. Instead, they are remembered because no investigation, no expert, and no witness has ever been able to explain exactly what happened. This is one of those stories. In the autumn of 2019, documentary photographer Aaron Mitchell accepted a commission from a regional history museum in North Carolina. His assignment was simple: spend 3 weeks traveling through the Appalachian Mountains, photographing abandoned schools, churches, railroad depots, and coal camps before time erased them completely. Aaron was 45 years old, meticulous, and unusually patient. He preferred working alone, often waiting hours for the right natural light before taking a single photograph. His reputation depended on accuracy, and he never embellished his experiences to make a story more interesting. Friends often joked that Aaron could spend an entire day documenting an empty building without speaking to another person. That quiet personality made what happened during his assignment even more difficult to dismiss. His journey began without incident. During the first week, he photographed abandoned mining communities across southwest Virginia before crossing into eastern Tennessee. Every evening, he uploaded his photographs, backed up his equipment, and wrote detailed notes describing each location. Those journals would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation because they documented exactly where he traveled, who he interviewed, and what he experienced each day. Nothing unusual appeared until the afternoon of October 14th, when he stopped at a nearly forgotten mountain church outside a community that no longer appeared on most modern maps. The church had been built during the early 1900s and officially closed more than 20 years earlier after the congregation became too small to maintain the property. Local volunteers still cut the grass several times each summer, but the building remained locked except during occasional historical tours. Aaron spent nearly 2 hours photographing weathered wooden pews, stained glass windows, and handwritten hymn books left inside glass display cases. Before leaving, he met an elderly volunteer named Charles Morgan, who had cared for the property for more than 15 years. Their conversation focused mainly on local history until Charles unexpectedly asked whether Aaron planned to continue driving after sunset. Aaron answered that he hoped to reach another abandoned school nearly 40 miles away before spending the night in a nearby motel. Charles paused before quietly replying, "If you're still in the mountains after dark, don't follow lights that weren't there during the day." Aaron assumed the comment referred to hunters or private property and thanked the man before continuing east. By late afternoon, clouds settled across the ridges while temperatures dropped quickly. Shortly after 7, darkness covered the mountain roads completely. Traffic became almost non-existent, leaving Aaron alone with little more than the sound of tires against damp pavement. Around 8:15, while crossing a narrow ridge, he noticed a single light glowing through the trees several hundred yards above the highway. At first, he assumed it belonged to an isolated farmhouse. Less than a minute later, another light appeared farther along the same ridgeline. Then another. Within 5 minutes, 6 separate lights stretched across the mountainside. None moved, none flickered. They remained perfectly steady despite there being no visible roads or buildings nearby. Aaron stopped at a gravel turnout to photograph the unusual sight. Through the camera's viewfinder, the lights appeared unusually bright against the dark forest. He adjusted focus several times but could not identify their source. They looked too small to be houses and too steady to be flashlights. After taking several photographs, he climbed back into his vehicle and continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, he rounded another bend and saw the exact same line of lights again, now appearing on a different mountain entirely. He checked his navigation screen to confirm he had continued east without turning around. The map showed no intersections capable of returning him to the previous overlook. Yet the pattern of lights looked identical, right down to their spacing across the ridge. The following morning, Aaron reviewed the photographs over breakfast, expecting to identify distant cabins hidden by darkness. Instead, every image showed an empty mountainside. The trees, ridges, and night sky appeared exactly as he remembered, but the lights themselves were missing. Thinking the camera had malfunctioned, he compared the digital timestamps. They confirmed the photographs had been taken during the exact period he remembered stopping beside the highway. Even stranger, his handwritten journal contained a sketch of the lights drawn immediately afterward while the memory remained fresh. Aaron rarely sketched anything unless he believed it might help identify a location later. Rather than dismissing the incident, Aaron returned to the same overlook the following evening under nearly identical weather conditions. He waited almost 3 hours. The lights never appeared. During the drive back, he stopped at a small diner where several longtime residents gathered each night after work. Curious, he casually mentioned seeing unexplained lights on the mountain. The conversation around him stopped almost immediately. Finally, an older woman seated near the window asked him a question. Were they all in a straight line? Aaron nodded. Without another word, the woman finished her coffee and quietly left the diner. No one laughed, no one offered an explanation. Instead, the owner walked over and changed the subject entirely, asking Aaron where he planned to travel next. Only after the other customers had gone did the owner explain why everyone became uncomfortable. Similar reports had circulated locally for generations. Hunters, utility workers, volunteer firefighters, and even state forestry employees occasionally described rows of steady lights appearing where no structures existed. Search teams sent to investigate never found electrical equipment, campsites, or evidence anyone had been on the ridges at all. Aaron spent the next several days researching county archives instead of photographing abandoned buildings. Inside a historical society office, he discovered newspaper clippings dating back to the 1950s describing unidentified mountain lights observed by unrelated witnesses across different decades. None of the reports claimed anything supernatural. Most suggested atmospheric conditions, distant vehicles, or optical illusions. Yet each investigation reached the same conclusion. No explanation fully matched the observations because the lights often appeared where roads had never existed. One forestry report even noted that helicopters flown over the reported locations during daylight found nothing but dense, untouched forest. When Aaron returned home, he organized the material into a presentation for the museum that had hired him. To the surprise of his colleagues, he removed every reference to the lights before the exhibit opened. Later, one curator asked why he excluded what seemed like the most interesting part of the assignment. Aaron's answer was simple. The photographs couldn't prove what I saw. The witnesses couldn't prove what they remembered. But none of us could explain it either. Years have passed since Aaron's journey through the Appalachians. The museum still displays his photographs of abandoned churches, forgotten schools, and empty coal towns. Visitors admire the images without realizing one chapter of the trip was intentionally left out. Somewhere among those mountains are ridges where experienced hunters refuse to chase distant lights after sunset, not because they believe every story they have heard, but because too many ordinary people with nothing to gain by inventing them, have described the same impossible sight for more than half a century. Perhaps there is a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the Appalachian Mountains still keep a few stories that no one has ever been able to explain. In this new story, For most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways, carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person, someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the back roads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic back roads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, The couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image captured during sunset clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all three cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving, don't stop, stay on the highway, reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. In this new story, long before GPS-guided drivers through the Appalachian Mountains, locals in southern West Virginia relied on narrow county roads connecting mining towns hidden between steep ridges. Many of those roads still exist today, winding through dense forests where abandoned coal camps slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. Most are perfectly safe during daylight. Yet, according to sheriff reports, volunteer search records, and decades of local newspaper archives, a handful of isolated locations continue attracting incidents that investigators have never fully explained. They are not officially closed. No warning signs tell visitors to stay away after sunset. Still, many longtime residents quietly agree on one thing. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In late September of 2019, 41-year-old environmental consultant Rebecca Morgan traveled from Charleston to survey water quality near an abandoned mining watershed outside Fayette County. Her company specialized in restoring streams damaged by decades of coal production, and Rebecca had spent nearly 15 years working in remote sections of Appalachia without a single serious incident. Colleagues described her as careful, experienced, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. Every survey followed the same routine. Arrive before sunrise, complete inspections before evening, and avoid overnight work whenever possible. That schedule changed after unexpected equipment failures delayed the project until late afternoon. Rebecca considered spending the night in a nearby motel, but weather forecasts predicted heavy rain beginning before dawn. Waiting until morning would force another full day of delays and additional travel costs. Shortly after 6:30, she packed her equipment and began driving toward the final monitoring station located near an abandoned mining settlement known decades earlier as Red Hollow. The community had once housed more than 300 families before the last coal operation closed during the mid-1980s. Today, almost nothing remained except broken foundations, scattered utility poles, and a weathered church standing alone beside the road. Before leaving the county maintenance office, Rebecca mentioned her destination to an older road supervisor named Carl Jenkins. Carl had lived in Fayette County his entire life and recognized Red Hollow immediately. Instead of discussing road conditions, he asked Rebecca what time she expected to finish. When she answered that she hoped to leave shortly after sunset, Carl became unusually serious. He quietly suggested postponing the inspection until morning. Rebecca assumed the warning related to rough terrain or wildlife activity. Carl simply shook his head and replied, "The road is fine. It's what people keep reporting after dark that worries me." Before Rebecca could ask another question, another employee interrupted the conversation, and the subject was never mentioned again. The drive toward Red Hollow followed a narrow two-lane road climbing steadily into the surrounding mountains. Cell phone reception disappeared almost immediately after she left the highway. Thick hardwood forests blocked nearly every view beyond the next curve, while abandoned rail lines occasionally appeared beside the pavement before vanishing beneath overgrown vegetation. Rebecca had driven similar roads countless times and noticed nothing unusual during the first hour except how completely empty they seemed. She passed only 3 vehicles, all heading toward town. None traveled in the opposite direction after sunset. At exactly 8:14, according to the timestamp later recovered from her dashboard camera, Rebecca rounded a curve and noticed an old church standing beside the road. Its white paint had almost completely faded away, leaving weathered wooden walls barely visible beneath moonlight. One upstairs window glowed faintly as though someone had left a single lamp burning inside. Rebecca slowed briefly, surprised that anyone still maintained the building after so many years. She continued another mile before reaching the creek crossing marked on her survey map. When she checked the GPS coordinates, they did not match the location recorded by her company. Somehow, she remained nearly 3 miles from the monitoring station despite following the only road available. Assuming she had entered incorrect coordinates, Rebecca turned around. Less than 10 minutes later, she passed the same church again. This time, the front entrance stood partially open. No vehicles occupied the gravel parking lot, no lights shone from nearby homes. The glowing upstairs window remained exactly as before. Rebecca glanced at the dashboard clock and noticed only 4 minutes had passed since she first saw the building. The distance between the church and the creek crossing should have required nearly 10 minutes at her average speed. She stopped briefly on the shoulder, restarted her navigation system, and confirmed the route had not changed. As she continued driving, the road became strangely familiar. Every sharp bend, fallen tree, and damaged guardrail appeared exactly where she remembered seeing them only moments earlier. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. Fresh tire tracks covered the dusty shoulder ahead before ending abruptly beside an abandoned bus stop. There were no tracks leading away. Rebecca stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to find another vehicle hidden among the trees. The forest remained completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed to disappear. Moments later, her handheld radio emitted several seconds of heavy static before a calm male voice quietly said, "You're going the wrong way." The transmission ended before she could respond. Company records later confirmed nobody else was using that frequency within 50 miles. Rebecca returned to her truck and continued toward the monitoring station without stopping again. Nearly 15 minutes later, she finally reached the location marked on her survey documents. The water sampling equipment remained exactly where technicians had installed it months earlier. She completed the inspection in less than 20 minutes before beginning the return drive. To her surprise, the church had disappeared entirely. The road where it should have stood contained only an empty clearing surrounded by broken stone foundations. State historical records later confirmed a church had once existed there, but burned to the ground during 1993 after being struck by lightning. No rebuilding permits were ever issued. The following week, Rebecca casually described the experience while submitting her field report. Instead of dismissing the story, another environmental consultant admitted witnessing something similar nearly 8 years earlier. Curious, the company's safety manager searched archived incident logs and discovered 3 unrelated employees had reported navigation problems near Red Hollow after sunset over the previous 2 decades. None mentioned ghosts or paranormal activity, all described passing landmarks that later proved no longer existed. The company quietly updated its internal safety guidelines soon afterward. From that point forward, environmental surveys near abandoned mining communities in southern West Virginia would end before sunset whenever possible. The policy cited reduced visibility and remote terrain as the official reasons. Unofficially, several longtime employees believed the change came after too many experienced field workers returned, describing roads that somehow led through places history had already erased. To this day, local deputies continue responding to occasional calls from travelers, reporting strange navigation errors, missing stretches of time, or abandoned buildings appearing where official maps show nothing at all. None of the reports have produced evidence proving anything extraordinary occurred. Investigators continue attributing most incidents to fatigue, unfamiliar roads, or poor nighttime visibility. Yet among the people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, one piece of advice survives generation after generation. If darkness falls while driving through the forgotten roads of southern West Virginia, and you suddenly recognize a place that should no longer exist, keep driving. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk, when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archive notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archived notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. In this new story, when investigators review emergency calls from the Appalachian Mountains, they quickly discover that the most unusual reports rarely involve violent crimes or major disasters. Instead, many begin with ordinary people describing something that simply did not make sense. A driver refuses to leave a vehicle after seeing someone standing beside an empty road. A family abandons a campsite before sunrise without taking their belongings. A veteran hunter suddenly turns around after spending decades walking the same trails. Most of those incidents are eventually explained through weather, wildlife, or simple misunderstanding. Others remain preserved inside county files because every practical explanation failed to account for the evidence. One such investigation began during the final week of July 2019 in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, where several unrelated travelers reported the same disturbing encounter after driving through the mountains long after dark. The reports all centered on Hollow Creek Road, a narrow two-lane highway winding through dense forest less than 15 miles from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. During daylight hours, the route was popular with hikers and anglers traveling toward nearby public lands. After sunset, however, traffic dropped dramatically. The road contained long stretches without homes, businesses, or reliable cellular service. Local deputies routinely patrolled the area because stranded motorists occasionally required assistance after hitting wildlife or suffering mechanical problems. Serious criminal activity remained rare, making the sudden increase in emergency calls during one particular week immediately stand out to investigators reviewing dispatch records. The first report came from a retired couple returning home after visiting relatives. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they contacted emergency dispatch after noticing a person standing beside the road near an abandoned wooden bridge. According to their statement, the individual appeared to be wearing dark clothing and remained completely still as their vehicle approached. Concerned that someone might have been injured or attempting to flag down passing traffic, the driver slowed to offer assistance. Before the vehicle reached the bridge, however, the figure disappeared behind the guardrail without crossing the road or entering the surrounding forest. Believing the person might have fallen down the steep embankment, the couple immediately contacted authorities. A deputy arrived less than 15 minutes later and searched both sides of the bridge using high-powered flashlights. Fresh rain earlier that evening had softened the muddy ground surrounding the roadside, creating excellent conditions for preserving footprints. Investigators found no tire tracks, footprints, or signs that anyone had recently climbed the embankment. The creek below remained shallow enough that an injured person could not have been carried away by the current. After completing a thorough search, the deputy concluded that the witnesses had probably mistaken a tree stump or roadside marker for a person while driving through darkness. The report was filed without further investigation. 2 nights later, dispatch received another call involving the exact same location. This time, the witness was an experienced commercial truck driver transporting livestock across the state. Unlike the previous callers, he carried a continuously recording dashboard camera. According to his report, he noticed what appeared to be a person standing beside the bridge long before reaching the location because the reflective stripes on the figure's clothing briefly caught his headlights. Expecting someone to wave for help, he reduced speed while preparing to stop. Instead, the figure remained motionless until the truck rounded the final curve. At that point, it disappeared from view. The driver immediately checked both side mirrors, expecting to see someone walking along the shoulder. The road behind him remained completely empty. Investigators obtained the dashboard camera footage, hoping it would identify the individual. The recording confirmed that the driver slowed significantly while approaching the bridge. It also showed a faint upright shape near the roadside, lasting only a fraction of a second before disappearing behind the truck's headlights. Image specialists enhanced the footage repeatedly, but could not determine whether the object represented a person, vegetation, or a brief lighting distortion caused by moisture on the camera lens. The video neither confirmed nor disproved the driver's statement, leaving detectives with evidence that raised more questions than answers. The investigation expanded after 3 additional motorists reported remarkably similar experiences during the following week. None of the witnesses knew one another, and each contacted emergency dispatch before local media became aware of the earlier reports. Every statement described the same section of Hollow Creek Road. Every witness believed they had seen someone standing beside the abandoned bridge. Every search conducted immediately afterward found nothing. Detectives carefully compared timelines, weather conditions, traffic volume, and witness backgrounds, expecting to identify a common factor linking the reports. The only consistent element remained the location itself. Rather than increasing routine patrols, the sheriff assigned 2 deputies to remain hidden near the bridge during several consecutive nights. Their objective was simple. If someone was deliberately frightening motorists, officers intended to intercept the individual before another emergency call occurred. The deputies positioned their vehicles well away from the highway and monitored the bridge using night vision equipment. Hours passed without incident. Shortly before midnight on the 3rd night, one deputy observed a vehicle suddenly slowing as it approached the bridge before accelerating away moments later. Dispatch immediately received another call from the driver reporting a person standing beside the roadway. The deputies reached the exact location in less than 40 seconds. Once again, nobody was there. Following that incident, engineers from the Tennessee Department of Transportation inspected the roadway, searching for reflective signs, damaged guardrails, unusual shadows, or roadside objects capable of creating the illusion of a standing person under certain lighting conditions. Surveyors mapped every tree, utility pole, and roadside marker visible from approaching vehicles. Computer simulations using identical vehicle headlights failed to recreate the appearance consistently described by witnesses. Although several combinations of shadows briefly resembled human shapes, none matched the reported height, position, or timing documented throughout the investigation. Detectives reluctantly ruled out the possibility that every witness had experienced the same optical illusion. As investigators reviewed older county archives, they discovered something unexpected. Nearly 23 years earlier, highway maintenance supervisors had submitted several reports describing motorists stopping along the same bridge after believing someone had been standing beside the road. Those reports contained no mention of ghost stories, local legends, or supernatural explanations. Instead, maintenance crews requested additional warning signs because drivers repeatedly braked unexpectedly while passing through the area after dark. The request was eventually denied after engineers failed to identify any roadway hazard requiring corrective action. The documents were quietly archived and forgotten until the current investigation brought them to light decades later. The sheriff officially closed the case after 6 weeks without identifying a suspect, uncovering evidence of criminal activity, or documenting additional reports. No missing persons were connected to the location, and no witnesses ever claimed the figure attempted to approach their vehicles or communicate with them. Detectives deliberately avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, concluding only that repeated witness observations could not be explained using the available evidence. Even today, Hollow Creek Road remains open to public traffic, carrying thousands of vehicles every year without incident. Yet, among local deputies who worked the investigation, one memory has endured. Every driver who reported the mysterious figure described the same reaction before contacting emergency dispatch. None believed they had encountered a ghost. Every one of them believed they had seen an ordinary person who desperately needed help. That simple assumption was exactly what brought them back to the bridge, and exactly what they could never explain. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern scientific explanation today. Archived notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable, heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archived notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing couple accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive entity However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely, wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains mostly completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed. Archived notes, carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation, confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth, melted door frames remains. University, biology, science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, on July 26, 2019, emergency responders were dispatched to a narrow stretch of State Route 16 in southern West Virginia after several passing motorists reported finding an abandoned pickup truck resting against a roadside guardrail. The collision itself appeared minor. The airbags had not deployed, the windshield remained intact, and investigators found no evidence suggesting another vehicle had been involved. What immediately concerned deputies was the complete absence of the driver. The truck's engine was still warm when the first deputy arrived, the headlights remained on, and the driver's wallet, cell phone, and vehicle keys were all found inside the cab. Under ordinary circumstances, investigators expected to locate the driver somewhere nearby within a matter of minutes. Instead, the search developed into one of the most unusual missing person investigations the county had handled in years. The truck belonged to 43-year-old Michael Turner, an electrical contractor from Beckley who had spent the afternoon inspecting power equipment at several rural substations following severe summer storms earlier that week. Company records confirmed he completed his final inspection shortly after 8 o'clock before beginning the 70-minute drive home. GPS records taken from his work tablet showed nothing unusual during most of the journey. He stopped briefly at a gas station, purchased coffee, and continued north along the same highway he had driven dozens of times before. Security cameras showed him leaving alone. Nothing in his behavior suggested confusion, distress, or any intention of changing his route. Deputies began searching the immediate area under the assumption that Turner had been injured and wandered into the surrounding woods seeking help. Volunteer firefighters, tracking teams, thermal imaging drones, and canine units spent the remainder of the night examining nearly 3 miles of steep forest surrounding the crash site. Fresh tire marks confirmed the pickup had gradually drifted onto the shoulder before striking the guardrail at relatively low speed. There were no signs of sudden braking, evasive steering, or mechanical failure. More puzzling still, investigators found only a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's door. Those tracks continued for approximately 80 yards before ending abruptly on a patch of exposed rock where tracking dogs lost the scent entirely. During the following morning, accident reconstruction specialists examined the vehicle in greater detail. They found no evidence of intoxication, medical distress, or equipment failure. The truck contained unopened groceries, work documents neatly organized on the passenger seat, and a cooler holding medication Turner was expected to take that evening. His wedding ring remained on the center console after he had apparently removed it while working earlier that day, a habit his wife later confirmed. Everything inside the truck suggested a man expecting to arrive home within the hour. Nothing suggested someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. Investigators next focused on Turner's digital activity. His mobile phone had stopped transmitting only moments before deputies arrived, but technicians recovered location data covering the final 30 minutes of his drive. The information revealed something unexpected. Although the truck had remained on State Route 16, the phone's internal compass repeatedly registered abrupt directional changes inconsistent with the road itself. Analysts initially suspected a software error until identical anomalies appeared in data collected from Turner's dashboard navigation system. Whatever caused the irregular readings affected 2 independent devices operating through different sensors. Engineers were unable to reproduce the malfunction during later testing. As search operations expanded, detectives interviewed motorists who had driven the same stretch of highway that evening. Most remembered nothing unusual beyond the abandoned pickup. One witness, however, provided a timeline that complicated the investigation. Traveling approximately 15 minutes behind Turner, she recalled passing the same white pickup twice within less than 10 minutes, despite remaining on the same road without making any turns. Investigators verified her route using toll records and fuel receipts. According to every available record, she could not have encountered the same vehicle twice unless one of the 2 timelines was incorrect. Yet, surveillance footage from a convenience store confirmed the time she entered the highway matched her statement almost exactly. State police analysts reviewed traffic cameras from neighboring counties, hoping to establish Turner's complete route. Every camera showed the pickup exactly where investigators expected until the final 12-mile section approaching the crash site. No cameras covered that stretch of road directly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events using witness statements, digital records, and estimated travel times. The resulting timeline contained an unexplained gap of nearly 26 minutes. Based on the distance involved, Turner should have reached the crash location long before emergency calls were placed. No evidence explained where he had been during those missing minutes. Search teams remained in the area for 12 consecutive days. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras surveyed nearby ridgelines, dive teams searched ponds and abandoned quarry pits. Hundreds of volunteers walked carefully spaced grid patterns across dense woodland. Despite covering more than 1,800 acres, investigators recovered nothing beyond the original footprints ending on exposed stone. The absence of additional physical evidence gradually shifted attention away from the surrounding forest and toward the unanswered questions contained within the timeline itself. Several months later, forensic analysts completed a detailed examination of the pickup's onboard computer. Among thousands of ordinary vehicle records, technicians discovered that every electronic system inside the truck had briefly lost synchronized time shortly before the collision. The discrepancy lasted only 43 seconds before correcting automatically. Individually, such errors occasionally occurred in modern vehicles. What attracted investigators' attention was that Turner's phone, work tablet, and dashboard navigation system all recorded nearly the same unexplained interruption within the same minute. Specialists from both the vehicle manufacturer and the software companies involved agreed on only one point. They had never encountered identical timing anomalies across 4 independent electronic systems operating simultaneously. The investigation officially remains open. Michael Turner has never been located, and no evidence has emerged indicating he intentionally disappeared or became the victim of a known crime. His truck still sits inside a secured evidence facility, preserved because investigators believe advances in digital forensics may someday explain details that current technology cannot. The official case file concludes with a straightforward assessment stating that the available evidence is insufficient to determine what occurred during the final half hour of Turner's journey. For the detectives who worked the investigation, however, the unanswered questions begin much earlier than the crash itself. They begin with the missing 26 minutes, a routine drive home, and one of the darkest July nights the county has ever tried to explain. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain back roads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times, despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. In this new story, There is a particular kind of silence that settles over small Appalachian towns during the final weeks of summer. By August, the days are still warm, but darkness arrives a little earlier. Porch lights appear before dinner is finished, and the forests surrounding isolated communities seem to grow larger after sunset. Most nights pass without anything worth remembering. But in August of 2019, families living along a quiet valley in Western Virginia began noticing something strange. It always happened between midnight and 3 in the morning. Nobody disappeared, no homes were broken into, and no crime was ever established. Yet before the month ended, several families had stopped sleeping upstairs, children were staying with relatives, and deputies were quietly driving the same roads every night, trying to discover who kept leaving the porch lights on at houses where nobody lived. The valley contained fewer than 40 occupied homes scattered along 7 miles of narrow road between two forested ridges. Many properties had belonged to the same families for generations. Several older houses stood empty after their owners died or moved closer to larger towns, leaving dark windows and overgrown yards between occupied residences. Everyone knew which houses were vacant. That familiarity was important because the first unusual report involved an abandoned farmhouse that had not received electricity in nearly 11 years. Shortly after 1 o'clock on August 4th, a woman living across the valley noticed its front porch light glowing steadily through the trees. She watched it for several minutes before deciding someone must have purchased the property. By morning, the light was gone. 2 days later, her husband walked to the farmhouse expecting to find contractors or signs of recent activity. The grass surrounding the building remained waist-high. A chain still secured the front gate, and fallen branches blocked part of the driveway. Through a broken basement window, he could see that the electrical meter had been removed from the exterior wall years earlier. Nothing suggested anyone had entered the property. He mentioned the light to a neighbor, who immediately described seeing something similar at another vacant house farther north during the previous night. That house had been empty since a fire damaged its kitchen 5 years earlier. Its porch light had also appeared shortly after midnight. The neighbors initially treated the incidents as an odd coincidence. Reflections from passing vehicles could create convincing illusions along the valley, especially when humid summer air settled close to the ground. That explanation became harder to accept after a third light appeared. On August 9th, a retired school teacher woke shortly before 2 in the morning and noticed a bright yellow glow outside her bedroom window. An abandoned cottage stood across the road approximately 100 yards from her property. Its porch was illuminated clearly enough that she could see the railing and front steps. She watched from her window for nearly 15 minutes. No vehicle approached, nobody crossed the yard. Then the lights switched off instantly. The following morning, she contacted the county sheriff's office. A deputy inspected the cottage and discovered that the electrical service had been disconnected 8 years earlier. The porch fixture still contained an old bulb, but wiring inside the wall had deteriorated badly enough that an electrician later confirmed it could not have operated normally. There were no footprints around the building and no signs of forced entry. The deputy considered the possibility of someone using a battery-powered lamp positioned behind the fixture as a prank, but removing the glass cover revealed years of dirt and insects that appeared completely undisturbed. The incident was documented and initially classified as suspicious activity. During the next week, the report spread along the valley. 5 vacant houses were involved, each separated by significant distance. Residents consistently described only one illuminated porch at a time. The light usually appeared after midnight and remained visible for several minutes before disappearing. Nobody reported seeing lights inside the houses themselves. Nobody saw vehicles parked nearby. More importantly, the sequence seemed to move gradually north. The first report came from the southern end of the valley. Each later sighting occurred at another abandoned property farther along the same road. By August 15th, deputies realized the next vacant house in that direction stood directly beside an occupied home containing a family with 2 young children. Rather than waiting for another report, Two deputies parked their patrol vehicles away from the road and watched the property overnight. They arrived before 11 and inspected the abandoned house while daylight remained. Every door was secured, every room was empty, and the porch light had no functioning electrical connection. One deputy positioned himself in woodland overlooking the front entrance, while the second remained inside an unmarked vehicle farther down the road. For almost 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, at 1:38 a.m., the deputy in the woods radioed that the porch had become illuminated. The second deputy reached the house in less than a minute. By then, the light had disappeared. Both officers searched the building and surrounding property using flashlights and thermal equipment. They found no person. The doors remained locked, windows remained secured, and vegetation surrounding the porch showed no evidence that anyone had recently walked through it. The officer who witnessed the light was certain it had originated near the porch ceiling rather than from passing headlights. His body camera had been operating throughout the observation, but the house stood near the edge of the recording's visible range. The footage showed a faint increase in brightness for approximately 40 seconds before darkness returned. It could not identify the source. The sheriff's office increased overnight patrols without publicly discussing the pattern. Investigators worried that publicity might encourage copycats and make the original activity impossible to separate from pranks. Meanwhile, residents began changing their routines. Some closed curtains before sunset, others installed motion lights and cameras. Several families began leaving dogs indoors overnight. The atmosphere throughout the valley changed despite nothing openly threatening having occurred. People were not frightened because someone had attacked them. They were frightened because something appeared to be moving slowly from one abandoned house to the next, and nobody knew what would happen when there were no empty houses left. On August 19th, that question became more difficult to ignore. The next property north had been abandoned only temporarily. Its owner, an 80-year-old widower, was recovering from surgery at his daughter's home several counties away. A neighbor watching the property noticed the porch light illuminated at 2:06 a.m. and immediately contacted deputies. Officers arrived while the light was still visible from the road. According to the incident report, it disappeared as the first patrol vehicle entered the driveway. Deputies searched the house and found nothing disturbed. Unlike the earlier properties, this home still had active electricity. Examination of the security system showed something unexpected. The porch light switch inside the locked house had physically moved into the on position. The homeowner insisted he had switched every exterior light off before leaving. Investigators could not prove otherwise. There was no smart home system, timer, or remote control connected to the fixture. Someone inside the house could easily have operated the switch, yet cameras installed at neighboring properties showed no person approaching or leaving during the relevant period. Doors showed no evidence of tampering. Windows remained locked from inside. Nothing was stolen. The incident provided the first clear evidence that the phenomenon might involve actual human interference, but it simultaneously made that possibility harder to understand. 3 nights passed without another light. Residents began hoping the strange sequence had ended. Then, shortly after midnight on August 23rd, something entirely different happened. A family living near the northern end of the valley woke to their front porch, light turning on. Their house was occupied. The father checked the hallway and confirmed everyone was inside. He walked toward the front room, expecting an electrical problem. Before reaching the door, he noticed a shadow moving across the curtains from outside. It passed slowly from one side of the porch to the other and stopped near the front steps. He immediately moved his family into an upstairs bedroom and contacted emergency dispatch. Deputies arrived 7 minutes later. The porch light remained on. Nobody was outside. Fresh mud covered part of the yard after an afternoon storm, yet no footprints approached the porch from the road or surrounding forest. Investigators searched beneath the house, behind nearby sheds, and along the creek bordering the property. Nothing was found. A motion-activated camera mounted above the garage had recorded the entire front yard. At 12:17 a.m., the porch light activated. Approximately 9 seconds later, the camera briefly adjusted its exposure as though something had moved close to the porch. No person appeared anywhere in the recording. The light remained on until the homeowner eventually switched it off after deputies completed their search. That became the final incident reported during August. The sheriff's office continued patrols through September, but no additional porch lights appeared unexpectedly. Investigators examined electrical systems at several affected properties, interviewed residents, reviewed camera recordings, and searched for connections between previous owners. Nothing produced a convincing explanation. The abandoned houses belonged to unrelated families. Their electrical conditions varied significantly. Some had functioning wiring, while others had been disconnected from the grid for years. There was no evidence linking the incidents to trespassers, teenagers, former residents, or anyone living nearby. Years later, several of the abandoned houses were demolished or renovated. New families moved into two properties without reporting anything unusual. The valley returned to the quiet routine it had known before that summer. Children grew older, residents moved away, and many people stopped discussing what happened. Yet, those who lived there during August 2019 still remember the order in which the lights appeared. One house after another, always moving north, always after midnight, always illuminating a porch where nobody should have been standing. The strangest detail was discovered much later when a retired deputy reviewed his notes while preparing old records for storage. He plotted every affected property on a county map and noticed something investigators had overlooked during the original response. The houses were not merely arranged from south to north. Each successive property stood almost exactly the same distance farther along the road. When the final occupied house was added to the sequence, the pattern formed a steady progression through the valley, as though something had been stopping at one porch every few nights before continuing toward the next. There should have been one more stop. Less than a mile beyond the final house stood another abandoned property hidden behind trees at the northern edge of the valley. Investigators had never included it because no unusual activity was reported there. When the retired deputy checked historical property records, he discovered why. The house had been demolished on August 22nd, one day before the porch light appeared at the occupied family's home instead. Nobody has ever established whether that timing meant anything. No official report describes the incidents as paranormal, and everyone involved accepts that an ordinary explanation may still exist. But for the families who spent those quiet August nights watching lights move slowly closer through the mountains, one question remains difficult to forget. If that last abandoned house had still been standing, would the light have stopped there instead?